I'll just introduce Professor Boettke quickly. So, Professor Peter J. Boettke is director of the FA Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, as well as the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and a distinguished university professor of economics and philosophy at the GMU, George Mason University again. He specializes in Austrian economics, economic history, institutional analysis, public choice, and social change. Professor Boettke has authored and co-authored more than 11 books, including his most recent uh, Living Economics, but I think that was quite a few years back.
Yeah, that's a
I believe
long
that
time.
was the your book on the collection of essays that you had on uh, I think it was on social change. I'm not very sure, but it was published by the Mercatus Center. It's a collection of lectures. And he's also the was the editor of the Review of Austrian Economics series, editor of the New Thinking in Political Economy book series, and co-editor of the Cambridge Studies in Economics, Choice and Society. He is a former Fulbright Fellow at the University of Economics in Prague, a National Fellow at Stanford University, and Hayek Visiting Fellow at LSE. And I think with that, I'll let Pushkar talk a bit about the society and what we do.
Thank you very much, Anshu. It is indeed a pleasure for Caucus to be hosting Professor Boettke. So a bit about ourselves. Caucus was formed in 2007 and it's 2025. We'll be turning 18 this year. It's almost a coming of age for us. 18 is when you turn an adult. We've come a long way indeed over this time. And one thing that we have striven to do this year is to really chart out a trajectory, a developmental trajectory, because India, in its post-colonial context, has really grappled with several different meta-narratives of growth and development and experimented pre-91, post-91, and the post-91 period has been a fantastic period of growth for us. And a lot of the vestiges of pre-91 India still linger on. We had a session where we hosted Professor Powell on central planning, lessons on liberty. So that was one session. But another aspect of it, which of pre-91 India, which still lingers on, is this visceral fear of markets as a tool to coordinate information. And I'm very grateful that Professor Boettke today has agreed to deliver a presentation on the socialist calculation debate. It's a topic that I personally found very fascinating and looking forward to learn a lot from this session and the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much, Professor Boettke, for agreeing to be with us today. Over to you, sir.
And thank you very much for that introduction and also for the explanation of your group. I'm excited very much for this opportunity. Can I share my screen?
Yes, sir, just a minute. You should be able to. Could you send me the request to share the screen?
Okay, everyone can see that fine?
Yes, sir, we can see it fine.
Okay, great. So as I said, I'm getting over a cold, so I might cough in between. I apologize for that. And I also, I'm doing this from home, so my dog might bark if the mailman comes by or anything. So just, there's great benefits to Zoom, and then there's some cost to it as well. So I'm going to talk about revisiting the socialist calculation debate, lessons for today. The talk is based on a new monograph of mine through Cambridge called the Socialist Calculation Debate. And then it's history and contemporary relevance. And to start, what I want to stress is something broader than just this debate. And that is that this debate actually is the core theoretical debate of the 20th century. It sets the dividing lines among various schools of economics about where to go. Not everyone recognizes that because it was so much of the background that you forget it, right? So, just to give you an example, the Coles Commission, which is where econometrics was really invented, was an effort to invent statistical analysis to centrally plan an economy. That's what their original goal was the Coles Foundation. In opposition to the Coles Foundation, which was all at the University of Chicago, right? That what did you have on the opposite side? Frank Knight and other economists that were agitating against, including all the way up through Jim Buchanan and whatnot. It was this Coles Commission versus the other people at Chicago was a key idea. And the idea under econometrics originally was what was called planometrics, right? Because the whole idea was to be able to have control variables. And there's a wonderful book out. I have a colleague, great colleague at George Mason University and Mercatus Center, Erwin Decker. And Erwin wrote probably the best book on the intellectual history of the early Austrian school. It's called The Viennese Students of Civilization. But he also then wrote another award-winning book, which is on Jan Tinbergen, the first large-scale macro modeler, right, who was the first Nobel Prize winner actually in economics. And that is all about the economics of control versus, say, the Viennese Students of Civilization, which is about the economics of understanding. And this contrast is huge and whatnot, and which makes my second point, which is that this debate was primarily methodological, not ideological. What matters in economics is the methodological aspects of the argument, not the ideological ones. When we think about capitalism, socialism, we think about these isms, we think about in terms of the ideological vision that they have. And there's no doubt that that's important. But what really matters is the analytical, methodological, and analytical arguments that come out of that. Okay, third point, which is that this debate is the critical episode in the refined articulation of the microeconomics of economic life. So when we think about broad, big debates, again, we tend to think about macro debates. Keynes versus Hayek, Keynes versus Friedman, right? These kind of big debates in the 20th century. But there was another debate, which was in fact the debate related to the microeconomic understanding of individuals, what we might call price theoretic understanding of an economy. And this episode really highlighted that. And as a result, it refined articulation of market process theory, which is Mises, Hayek, and Kerzner, but also public choice theory, the application of economic reasoning to politics, the understanding of the institutional infrastructure. So you have property rights economics, law and economics, and then in broader sense, new institutional economics. And these all can be traced fundamentally to an understanding of the socialist calculation debate. For example, Ronald Coase, the reason why he wrote his original paper on the theory of the firm was because he was a student in Arnold Plant's class at the London School of Economics. And Plant was teaching about Mises and Hayek's views on the socialist calculation debate. This is in the early 30s. And Coase asked himself a question. Well, if markets are so great, how come we don't just engage in spot markets for everything? Right? Why would we ever, have collections of individuals working together? Right? Why wouldn't we just have spot markets? We'd buy here, buy there, whatever, add it up, sell there. And he came up with the idea that the transaction costs, right, were too high to have spot markets and everything. So then, if organization is so great, right, why don't we have just one giant big firm, right? Like, India Inc. Why can't we have that? And so then Coase identified, well, there's transaction costs with that as well, which are metering and monitoring costs, right? You have to monitor economic behavior and you have to meter behavior, which is determine whether or not its costs and benefits, its marginal benefits exceed its marginal costs. And so again, you have, you can't have pure spot markets. You can't have pure one firm, right? You have to actually, and so then he had this notion of where is the boundaries of the firm, right? That comes from him addressing what the issue is that Arnold Plant was asking him to think about. And this is a similar kind of question across the board. The Ostroms, which I was asked about before we started talking, the Ostroms were motivated by this idea of where public administration begins. And where public administration begins is where the realm of economic calculation ceases to be operable. All right. And so they had to then define again the boundaries of where economic calculation couldn't solve local public economy questions. All right. I'll elaborate some more on this. for the contemporary relevance, and I just added this in here. This isn't in the monograph, but it's just to try to relate these ideas to you, which is the relevance of its own economic history to India itself. So, as you all know, Nehru, after independence, basically borrowed his economic ideas from some mix between the Fabians in Britain and the Stalinist 5-year planning model, right? So this is what India's model was, some mix between that. And the record of that, plus, for example, as you know, the license Raj, which was accepted in the 1940s, which meant that you had to basically get a license for everything, right? Which is what led, you mentioned, Anshua mentioned about Mansur Olson. One of the things that Mansur Olson started earlier was a thing called the Institute for the Study of the Informal Sector. That was his center at University of Maryland, Institute for the Study of the Informal Sector, IRIS. And the reason why he came up with that was because he was trying to understand the costs of doing business. So when you have the cost of doing business legally rise, what happens? The informal sector ends up by dominating, right? And so now when you try to reform an economy, let's say a centrally planned economy, you're not actually reforming a centrally planned economy. You're reforming a bureaucracy and an informal sector, right? And that has its own set of incentives that you have to dig into and everything like that. Well, just think about all the sort of, side deals and other kind of things that were associated, because in India, they raised the cost of opening up a business so large, right? So this is what led to bribing. This is what led to all these various different things, which were part of the culture that was associated. One example that I think is fascinating, and you might know a lot more about, though it's ancient history for you now, is actually how, when the 5-year plans were established, I think in the 1960s, they put an emphasis on steel production. All right, and everything, massive steel production. Well, what ended up by happening is they prioritized heavy industry. Well, that meant that they didn't allow steel production to go be allocated towards things like bicycles. And yet bicycles were a major way of vehicle transportation in the cities. All right. And so then what happened was there was a shortage of steel for producing of bicycles, but yet there was an increased demand for producing bicycles. Now play out the sort of scenario, what goes on to sort of do that. That's all the consequences of the policies in a very real sense. All right, so this led to rather poor economic growth, poor economic development post-independence, and eventually this leads to the 1991 reforms, which you just mentioned, and end up by having, and a key part of that is introducing not only the domestic reforms, but entering into the international economy and globalization and everything else that has followed from that. Fifth point is the contemporary relevance for the current intellectual context, which is the promise and prospects of advanced technological developments with AI and what the consequences of that are for the development of the debate. All right, that was a little longer than I wanted to go into, but I wanted to set the context. So this is a great article that was in the Journal of Economic Literature, which is one of our top journals in economics. It's published by the American Economic Association. And this is an article, and it just makes this point that I was making at the end. Without this debate, mainstream economics would not be as we see it today. All right, without this debate. Now, a lot of times, the reason why this gets forgotten is because a particular perspective was perceived to have won the debate. And then that frames the way we think about economics. And then we forget who were the counter arguments to it. Okay, or we look at stuff like mechanism design theory and we forget what originally its goal was to do, which is Leonard Hurwitz is the inventor of mechanism design theory, also a Nobel laureate. When he was a student, he first went to Geneva to study with Mises. And then he left studying in Geneva with Mises and moved to the London School of Economics to study with Hayek. Why? Because he wanted to prove Mises and Hayek wrong. All right. And so what he did was he adopted Mises and Hayek's criticism of socialism to then try to invent a theory that could meet their criticisms. And that's what mechanism design theory was all about. Can I design a mechanism that's incentive compatible and informational generating to be able to plan an economy? Okay. He died before he was able to accept the Nobel Prize. His final paper that he wrote, which ends up by being his Nobel lecture, is Who Will Guard the Guardians? So let's assume that I can design a mechanism such that I could centrally plan an economy. Who's going to guard the guardians to make sure that they actually do what they're supposed to do to plan the economy right? That's going to be a key thing to remember, because that's exactly what Hayek was worried about, why the worst get on top, what Buchanan is worried about in public choice, right? Who's going to guard it? Why do you have to have constitutional political economy? Hurwitz already came to that conclusion after all of this long thing. So you cannot understand modern mainstream economics unless you understand the history of this debate. Why was socialism so attractive? Let's recognize that point. So it's not like people just like drank crazy juice and then said, oh, I'm crazy. I believe in these crazy ideas. There's a reason why they believe in those ideas. Why did Nehru turn to socialism as his answer to post-colonialism, right? Why would that be the case? Well, first, as we experience the world as is, we have to remember that the world is awash in social ills. We have poverty, ignorance, squalor, disease, idleness. We have difficulties that are associated with the dogma of the church, with the violence of the sword, with the bondage of slavery, with the drudgery of the plow, right? And so how do we address these kind of arguments? Okay, so that meant that we had to have a theoretical or philosophical examination. And the theoretical and philosophical examinations of capitalism, according to the socialists, were that capitalism suffered systematically from inefficiency and injustice. So the argument goes as follows. Capitalism suffers from inherent monopolistic tendencies. That leads to a concentration of capital. Capitalism suffers from inherent instability. That is because production and use are separated. Therefore, we can have disproportionality, right, which leads to macro volatility. The inherent instability reinforces the inherent monopolistic tendencies, because in the wake of the instability, who are the ones that can survive? The larger firms, and they gobble up the smaller firms, therefore making the economy even more concentrated. Laissez-faire capitalism is a fiction because of the inherent forces at work. There's always going to be state capitalism, state monopoly capitalism, meaning the state is always going to put its thumb on the scale to favor some at the expense of others. So mercantilism is basically the natural state of ideas, and the natural state of mercantilism is the late stage of capitalism, is imperialism and war, and add colonialism in that. So of course, if I'm a post-colonialist, I'm going to agitate against the very thing that was my oppressor, right? And so this is why socialism is so attractive in the 20th century. But what do economists have to say about social problems, from Adam Smith all the way up to Hayek? Economists are not blind to the suffering of mankind. That is a mistake, which I'll come back to in a second. But this is a basic quote from Adam Smith, right? No society can surely be, flourishing and happy, which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, right? So economists recognize the social ills. It was never heartless, right? Think about the portrayals of economics. Many of you are economics students. I'm sure you've heard all the jokes from your English, or literature friends or philosopher friends, right? Read like Charles Dickens's. We just celebrated Christmas here, right? And so, one of the most famous Christmas stories in the US, the UK, is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. All right, where Ebenezer Scrooge is asked to provide assistance for the poor, and he says that they should go to the poorhouses, and the people asking for the charity say to him, many people would rather die than go to the poorhouses. And Scrooge responds, this is before the ghost visits Scrooge. Scrooge responds and says, well, good, that will reduce the surplus population. Right. So he's like, that's the way people thought economists thought. The miserly, greedy, the Malthusian struggle for survival, reduce the surplus population. That's the way that we go forward. Then, of course, Scrooge is visited by the three ghosts, and then he's change of heart. And then now he's a man of charity and goodwill. And gives his money away and all of that stuff. But Dickens wrote an earlier book called Hard Times, which is about, the Industrial Revolution, and he sees, the plight of children in England, and, he studies this, and then he calls the economists the philosophers of fact. Right. And this is, that's meant as a derogatory term, the philosophers of fact, rather than the philosophers of the heart. Right, who have compassion. So economists lack compassion. And there's an old phrase, right, which is that economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Right, so you might hear that. But that's never been the way that economists have thought about this issue. What the economists have always thought about is what is the most effective way to both minimize human suffering while maximizing human flourishing. But choices are always against constraints. Right? So economists always recognize that we're facing this world of trade-offs and constraints. So we have to maximize human flourishing while minimizing human suffering against the constraint of nature, that's scarcity and trade-offs, the necessity of coordinating distant and disparate individuals to realize productive specialization, assuring cooperation among a multitude of strangers. This is the mutually beneficial exchange. And raising the welfare of the least advantaged in society and the most vulnerable. That's about peace and generalized prosperity. So again, it's important to always remember whenever we have these conversations to stress that the systematic development of the economic science by Adam Smith was a critique of the privileged system of mercantilism. Smith, in a letter describing his book, The Wealth of Nations, says that my book is a violent indictment on all of British commercial life. All right, so modern leftist critics, read that and they say, see, Smith, he was against capitalism. No, he's against mercantilism. The book is an indictment of mercantilism. It's an embrace of laissez-faire markets, right? So it's a critique of the privileged system, and that the birth of economic liberalism is in the same vein as the birth of political liberalism. We're trying to eradicate the obstacles created by power and privilege to enable the freedom of ordinary individuals, and that freedom will allow them to develop and rise commercial society to lift humanity from misery and the misery of poverty and the domination by unchecked authority. Okay. Why is this economic calculation? Like I've been waxing on philosophically or whatever here, but why does economic calculation matter at all for any of this stuff? And what is it? So the reason why it matters, right, is let's start on the right-hand column, right, is the socialist project was premised on the rationalization of production. We needed to rationalize the process of production so that we would have such a burst of productivity that we would move from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. It's only when we have the kingdom of freedom that we can eradicate the class conflicts. Right? That we can address the inefficiencies and injustice of capitalism. So, right? So we have to get to that kingdom of freedom. We have to rationalize production. Now, due to the socialist critique of private property and the anarchy of production, the invisible hand, the argument was the only way that you could rationalize production was through the abolition of private property and the substitution of production for direct use rather than production for exchange. So central planning. Okay? So no ownership and planning. Marx used the metaphor of an orchestra. None of the members in the orchestra have to own the instruments, but they do have to have the conductor, right? That is able to conduct the orchestra. Thus, the assessment of the efficiency of socialist means to obtaining socialist ends is the primary task of the economist. We economists, our practice of our science, not we individual economists, but the discipline of economics itself is a value-free science. We, as scientists, are valuing actors, right? So we don't deny that. but the science of economics. So the way we debate with one another is not to say, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, right? That would be the wrong way to go about this. The way we do this is we take the ends of our intellectual adversary as given, all right? And we analyze our adversary's chosen means to obtain those given ends. All right? So when Mises and Hayek pick up pen to paper, they're not Ayn Rand, right? Ayn Rand's very valuable for those who believe in liberty, right? But she's a moral critic of collectivism, right? It's the value system of collectivism that she's annihilating. What Mises and Hayek are doing is they're utilitarians. What they're doing is they're analyzing the consequences of the chosen means in the ability to obtain the given ends. So let's assume that the ends of collectivism are laudatory. Now, is the means the abolition of private property and the substitution of production for direct use for exchange? Will it achieve those laudatory ends? And their argument is, nope, not going to happen. All right? It's not going to happen. And therefore, rational economic calculation, which is essential to rationalization of production, is not going to take place. And so rather than producing more with less, which is what would be necessary to go from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, we end up producing less with more, which then ensnares us in the kingdom of necessity. So, all right, so that's the reason why economic calculation is so important for this debate. It's what Mises calls the linchpin in the argument against socialism. But what is it exactly that economic calculation does? Because a lot of people get confused about this. All right, what economic calculation does, it is a competitive process for the allocation of scarce capital goods among competing ends. All right, so the abolition of private property in the means of production, right? This is the socialist idea, right? We have to abolish the private property in the means of production. Think again to the orchestra. He's not abolishing music, right? That would be a consumer good. Abolishing the ownership of those instruments that you're playing. All right, so you have to abolish the private property in the means of production. And what economic calculation is how are these scarce capital resources going to be done? So Mises's syllogism was very straightforward. Without private property in the means of production, there's no market for the means of production. Without a market for the means of production, there's no relative prices for the various different means of production. Without relative prices, you cannot engage in rational economic calculation. All right? So that's the sort of logical syllogism that he makes. Well, why does that matter? It's because this mechanism of sorting among the technologically feasible production projects, those which are economically viable. So it's not that we're saying that the production that is technologically unfeasible. No one's saying that, I don't know how many here ever saw Star Trek, but that Star Trek, they have these, transporters, so you just go, beam me up. So I could be there in India right now because you could just go, beam me up, Scotty. And I would go, boop, and then I'd be in your room. And then when I'm done, I'd come back here or whatever, right? So we're not trying to argue for that. What we're trying to argue is among all the technologically feasible projects, which would be the most economically viable, right? And so, I teach principles of economics. When I first started teaching principles of economics, George Mason had grown from a medium-sized school to a very big school very fast. We're the largest school in the state of Virginia, but at one time we were kind of a middle-level school. So they grew the school size, the population very fast, which meant that they had a parking problem at the school because we're largely a commuter college. But yet, we didn't have enough parking spaces. So I asked the students, I said, these are principals, so they're 18-year-olds, never had economics, okay? So this was a question to them. Using the price system, and only the price system, fixed the parking problem at George Mason University, right? So as you might have guessed, what I was hoping to find was differential pricing. The spots that are closer to the campus price at a really high price. The spots that are farther from the campus price at a low price. And then, based on the willingness to pay, people will allocate the parking spaces, right? Okay. what did my 18-year-old kids write? Every single one of them wrote a technologically feasible project. All right, here's the kind of answers I got. Let's make it mandatory that all vehicles on campus only have 2 wheels. That way we could, make double the parking spots. Because right now the parking spots are for 4-wheeled vehicles. If we make them only for 2-wheeled vehicles, motorcycles or bicycles, then look, we'll double the number of things and it won't be a problem. Didn't use the price system there, right? So they're getting a bad answer on that one, but it's not technically unfeasible. We live close to the Beltway, the major Beltway that goes around Washington, D.C. One of the answers was, let's build a parking garage right on the Beltway, and then on the top, we can have a helicopter, and the helicopter can transport students to the central of the campus and whatnot. Of course, that's feasible, but it's not economically viable, right? So this is the whole question, is that as we're engaged in these massive production projects, 5-year plans, they are technologically feasible. Like, how much steel can you produce? The question is, what is the most economically viable way to produce steel to get more with less rather than less with more? All right, so this is fundamentally part of the rivalrous process of the market, property prices and profit and loss. And that rivalrous process produces and communicates the contextual nature of the knowledge in the economy. And that leads us to understand the discovery of opportunities, the utilization of resources, the communication of that through the price system, and most importantly, adaptation and revision to changing circumstances. This is going to be one of the key things. The market is not just a utilizer of information, it is a generator of information. Generating that information or knowledge only takes place within that process. Eliminate that process, that knowledge doesn't exist. It's not that it's out there and it's just difficult to collect. It literally was never generated. It never came about. It never came into being. So therefore, you can never use it. These are 2 very simple projects. First, this is a standard finance or econ 101 question. It's called a present value calculation or future value calculation of an investment. All right. So, we have a lottery here in the U.S. People are given a choice if they win the lottery, whether or not they should take it all in one lump sum or have it paid out over time, right? And so one of the things you do is a simple present value calculation of whether or not you'd rather have the lump sum today or whether or not you'd rather have a smaller sum but paid out over 20 years or something like that. How do you do that calculation? Well, what you do is you fit it into this equation. Now, that's simple. But what I want to ask you something about is, what are the background conditions that are necessary for that simple calculation to actually make any sense? Imagine, for example, that there was no protection of persons or property. That is, when you have assets in your hand, I could bop you over the head and take them from you. So you have no stability in possession. All right? There's no transference by consent. There's no keeping of promises. Now, if that world is in existence, what are you going to be able to do with this kind of calculation? It's not going to be able to work. How about if we have high bouts of inflation? Well, the interest rate's going to be all over the place, right? So the calculation is going to be off. How about if, in fact, we socialize, we privatize profits, but socialize losses? How are you going to actually, engage in that calculation? So we have to think always about the background institutions that are involved in the protection of property, the security of property rights, the security of persons. We have to think about the nature of the monetary system. We have to think about the nature of the fiscal system, right? All of those things are part of what it is when we make these calculations. So institutions matter. That's the key idea. Institutions cannot be just treated as background and not paid attention to. In order for us to engage in the most basic of economic life, we are always embedded within political, legal, and social institutional structures. And as economists, we cannot ignore those. All right? Finally, back to my point about parking spots. How do you know how to build a railroad track out of platinum rather than steel? Platinum is actually a technologically superior metal. They would make for smoother tracks, longer lasting tracks. Okay? Why don't we build railroad tracks out of platinum rather than we build it with steel? And you're going to say right away, well, it's too expensive. How the hell do you know it's too expensive unless you have a price system to tell you that's too expensive? If it's just technology, you would just pick the technologically superior, path. But we have to weigh that against its economic viability, precisely because we want to produce more with less. We want to rationalize production. If we built railroads with platinum, we would have platinum not go to its highest valued use. It would go to a less valued use, which would make us all poor. Okay. The point I want to stress here is just simple. You guys have my PowerPoint. I sent it on. So I'm not going to read these big quotes, but you'll have these quotes and you can also see them in the monograph. But I'm going to pick off little pieces from each of the quotes. But so it's clear, Mises argues, so economic calculation is about economic forces at work, not after they've worked. When you think in terms of equilibrium economics, so I don't know how many of you are economics majors and whatnot, so I apologize. But if you just think about the competitive model that you learn in either principles or micro one, the perfectly competitive model, right? And you learn to draw the curves such that the marginal revenue curve the sort of demand curve and the marginal cost curve line up, and such that price equals marginal cost and output is at that level, which minimizes average cost. Okay, that's an equilibrium proposition, right? Price equals marginal cost, output at the right, and that's the zero profit condition and all the other kind of things that go. That's economic life after all the various different agitation of economic life has taken place. It's when we settle down, when it's done. That's the definition of equilibrium. We actually end up in a position where no one has any incentive to change from that position, right? Because why? Because all of the gains from trade have been exhausted. All the least cost technologies have been employed, okay? That's not what Mises is talking about. He's talking about all the activity prior to that settling down. So if you think about, just draw a supply and demand curve, and then shade in the consumer surplus and the producer surplus on the left of the equilibrium point. Each one of those little shaded areas represents gains from trade, right? If we are trying to, if equilibrium is here, and we're, my demand curve looks like this, and my supply curve looks like this, and this is where equilibrium is, all the activity that's over here represents gains from trade or gains from innovation that could be had, right, as we move along, okay? So that's where all economic life takes place. That's the higgling and bargaining of the market, as Adam Smith put it. So as Mises says here, it's clear that under stationary conditions, the problem of economic calculation doesn't arise. Why? Because it's already been solved. That's why we're in equilibrium. So you can't answer the calculation problem by pointing that we have competitive equilibrium, right? Because that already is after it's all worked out. The question is, how does it come about, that equilibrium? So as Mises points out at the end of this statement, the problem of economic calculation is one of dynamics. It's not a problem of economic statics. And the role that is played by capital markets and speculation is precisely in the disequilibrium that results before we get to equilibrium, right? It's the economy that is perpetually subject to change, an economy that evolves day to day with new problems which have to be solved. That's the role that property prices and profit and loss play. All right, property rights are going to incentivize us, prices are going to guide us, profits are going to lure us, losses are going to discipline us. Each one of those is about bringing forth an activity, right? Rather than this. There's a great article that was published about a year ago by the complexity theorist Brian Author that you should look up if you're really into economics. And it's called Economics in Nouns and in Verbs. Economics in Nouns and Verbs. If you can't find it, just email me. I will send you a copy of it. What Arthur argues is that we need to have a economics that's associated with verbs, not with nouns. Our economic theory is all about nouns, which is states of affairs. But what economics of verbs is about is economics of activity. And we need to study activities, not necessarily states of affairs. So it's a very, and that's what complexity theory is trying to do. Okay. All right, so you have these optimality conditions: price equals marginal cost, output at the minimum point on the average cost curve. And when people are studying this issue and they're not getting what Mises is trying to say, as Hayek says here, the fact that has never been denied by anybody except socialism that these formal principles ought to apply to a social society. The question that Mises raised was not whether or not they ought to apply, but whether they could be applied in the absence of a market. That's the key issue. Again, Hayek says that part of the reason here is that Mises's arguments, which while stated very clearly, they require an understanding of the economic process. And a lot of economists by the 1930s had lost sight of understanding the economic process. That's different from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill. Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, it was all about understanding the economic process. The higgling and bargaining of the market. Say's law of the market is an emerging process theory of the market, not an equilibrium theory of the market. Equilibrium economics really becomes dominant after Walras. All right, there's hints of it in earlier writers, like, for example, Ricardo, who wanted to purge economics of human beings, right? Why would I want to purge economics of human beings? Because the human beings that are ones that mess up the equilibrium, right? They're the ones with new creativity. They're the ones with new ideas. They're the ones who engage in entrepreneurial action. So if I want to have the stasis, I got to get rid of the things that cause the stasis. And so I want to purge that and then have it be the long run determinant. The costs are the values determined by the long run, costs of production of an activity, which is Ricardo. But Ricardo doesn't really have a fully worked out equilibrium system, right? He's still kind of, the equilibrium is emerging out of this. But Walras, when we get to Walras and the development of economics 10, now we have equilibrium economics and equilibrium body, and we're studying Pareto, all of that. By the way, just as another history of thought idea, I don't know how many of you know this, but Pareto converted from economics to sociology late in life. And the reason why he did that was because he wrote the Manual of Political Economy, which is all about equilibrium economics. And he lays out basically the optimality conditions beautifully in that book. And then he looks out the window and he's like, what the heck? How come the world doesn't look like my manual? Right? I got it all worked out into the nice equations and it's smooth and everything like that. It's smooth. It's twice differentiable, right? It's a determinate outcome. What the hell's going on out in the world? And so he realizes that economics doesn't explain, as he understood it, the world. So instead, he has to study sociology. That is social forces, charisma, power, all these other things. And that's what he writes in his 4-volume work on mind and society, right? But again, what he does is he purges the individual. He gets equilibrium. Then he looks out in the world and says, humanity doesn't fit that model. So I got to study something else other than the model to understand humanity. What Mises and Hayek were arguing is that economics is the guide to study that. You don't have to abandon economics to understand the world out the window. In fact, economics is the greatest set of eyeglasses for understanding the world out the window. You just have to use it the right way. So what Hayek says here is that because they didn't understand Mises, they didn't understand what the role that economic calculation was actually playing. They don't understand this key idea going all the way back to that present value calculation that I laid out to you. Okay, so where's like a quick summing up here for the stages of the debate. to try to get through this stuff as quickly as possible to maximize questions. All right, so the debate starts out non-economists who just, didn't understand that we live in a world of scarcity. They presupposed we lived in a world of plenty, and it was just politics determining whether or not you allocated resources in a way that was just or unjust. And so what economists had to first do is point out we live in a world of scarcity. The scarcity necessitates negotiating trade-offs and economizing behavior. All right, everyone buys into that. Now, why is property ownership essential to that? Well, property ownership is essential because it gives us ownership and incentive, control issues and incentives, right? Now, this is the oldest critique in intellectual history. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's critique of Plato for collective ownership, right? So it's the oldest. Everyone understood this. Why is it that Mises and Hayek don't just say incentives matter, QED, end of story? All right. If everyone owns everything, no one owns anything, therefore no one has an incentive to improve it. Why don't we just stop there? Think about what socialism, especially in its mature form with Marxism, argued. It argued that the base determines the superstructure. All right. So it's called dialectical materialism. All right. This is the underlying philosophical position. Excuse me. If the base determines the superstructure being the ideas, attitudes, beliefs, the base being the material conditions, if I transform the material conditions so that I no longer have private property, but now have collective property, what do I do to the superstructure? I change humanity, right? So when you say that the individuals under collective ownership won't have the same incentives that they would have under private ownership, the socialist doesn't care because it's not the same person. So if I just said to you, oh, collective ownership can't achieve those goals because incentives matter, that is an argument stopper, not an argument engager, because the other side just says, Homo economicus doesn't apply. We now have Sovieticus, right? Homo Sovieticus, which is man is now a collective being. It doesn't have the same kind of incentives. It doesn't have the same desire for acquisition. It does, all these things like that. So while we recognize that incentives matter, it doesn't engage with with what you would call steel man in an argument. Right? So if you want to steel man an argument, you give as much intellectual ground to your opponent as possible. All right? And then show that even given all those assumptions, heroic assumptions, you still have these vulnerabilities. And so what they then focused on was, okay, so we recognize that management and incentive issues matter, but what is the essential problem is even if the managers wanted to do the right thing, the question would be, how would they come to know what the right thing to do is? And this is where the knowledge problem comes in. All right. And so we need to have prices as information communicators. We need to have a competitive process to be a generator of those prices. All right. So this is how we get knowledge about relative scarcity and the trade-offs that individuals are making in the face of scarcity. Now, profits lure us, and if we are lured in the right direction, we accumulate profits. But if we're lured and we go in the wrong direction, we end up by accumulating losses and we get disciplined. So this provides us with the feedback in an uncertain world about allocation of our scarce resources. And so then we started to understand what generates response to constant change, what generates innovation in the economy, development, something like that. Because remember, again, you're trying to have a burst of productivity, right? And a generation of this. And then finally in this debate, we recognize that politics or an institutional infrastructure provides the guardrails that respect rights of individuals and dignity of individuals. And so if you erode those guardrails, you're going to erode the ability to protect the rights and dignity of individuals in the society. And so socialism ends up by leading to the road to serfdom rather than the road, the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. So again, property rights provide incentives, prices guide, profits lure, losses discipline, and all this takes place within a legal, political, and social setting. And again, the very definition of economic rationality is to produce more with less, not produce less with more. So we have to, that debate. So now enter into the debate with the neoclassical market socialists, mainly Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner. And you'll see again why it is that both institutions and incentives by definition are eliminated by Lange. And so there has to be responses back. And so he accuses Mises of being an institutionalist because he ties the right to private property with the ability to engage in rational economic calculation. He wants to have an institutionalist economics. As Francis Beitor, close colleague of Paul Samuelson, put it in the 1950s, the goal was to have an institutionally antiseptic theory, an institution that didn't recognize the differences in institutions between collective ownership, private ownership, and whatnot. This is why, for example, Armin Alchin had to reinvent property rights economics. All right, I'll come back to this in a second on this. But this is in his uneconomic theory of socialism. He's like, Mises is an institutionalist. He denies it. Lerner tells us what? That incentive questions are sociological questions. Remember Pareto out the window? They're sociological questions. So we have to leave those to the side. We are not going to study those because they're not economics. Instead, what we're going to have to do is not address the incentive incompatibilities, but the technical optimalities that are required when we have an equilibrium state. And in that idea, the Walrasian auctioneer is just substituted with a central planning board. So I have a Walrasian auctioneer that does the Tadamont process of adjusting, there's pre-reconciliation of bids and asks prior to the posted price. All right, that's all the higgling and bargaining takes place prior to the model. All right, now we're going to have the central planning board engage in it. And what are they going to do? The central planning board would instruct managers of state enterprises to simply follow the rules of profit maximizing associated with perfect competition. That is, price according to marginal cost, produce at that level of output that minimizes average cost. And by doing so, the managers will grope towards a condition of perfect competitive equilibrium. And they'll do it in a much more rational way than they will in the Tadamont series of Walras. Moreover, precisely because the managers of the state enterprises are now outside of the realm of the sort of capitalist economy, they won't suffer from the incentives of the bureaucratic incentives of the inherent tendency of monopoly, and they won't suffer from periodic business cycles. So socialism can perform capitalism identically in theory, and in practice, socialism will outperform capitalism because it won't suffer from monopoly or from business cycles. That was the claim. Okay? Now, Milton Friedman, sometimes we forget that Milton Friedman was a microeconomist because we know him so well for his macroeconomics, his monetarism. But Milton Friedman actually was he was a price theoretic economist. This is great in the Jennifer Burns book on Friedman. But so Friedman writes a review of Abel Lerner's book. By the way, going back to my earlier conversation about Erwin Decker's, look what Lerner titled his book, The Economics of Control. Okay, so you understand this is the economics of control versus the economics of understanding, right? What's Adam Smith's title? An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He's trying to understand a pattern of social arrangements which have already generated why some nations are rich and other nations are poor. Right? In Smith's example that you all know, right, about the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. The dinner is already on my table. It's already there. I'm already eating it. The question is, how the hell did it get there? All right. So he's trying to understand a pattern of behavior. In Keynes, in Lange, in Lerner, they're trying to orchestrate the pattern of behavior. They're trying to control the activities of individuals. They are Adam Smith's chess master, moving the pieces on the chessboard, right? They're men of systems. So Friedman comes along, and this is the very beginning of his career, and he writes this long essay. And one of the things that he points out is that there's nothing logically flawed from a pure mathematical point of view from what Lerner's arguing, right? Meaning that it's a logically valid argument. It's a logically valid argument. What it's not is a logically sound argument, right? It's a logically sound argument. The premises are true. The deductions are correct. The conclusions are true, right? And logically valid, all we have is internal coherence, right? The theory doesn't undermine itself by its own contradictions, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has any application to the world that we live in. And so Friedman's argument is that this is a logically unassailable work that's completely impractical. It has no relevance to the world that humans occupy. Why? Because he doesn't deal with the administrative cost of policy, right? He doesn't deal with it. What are those problems? Friedman's famous problem for rules versus discretion is first stated in 1947. He says there's a time recognition, right? There's time between the recognition of a problem, a policy implementation, and the impact of the policy. So there's a long and variable lag. Those of you who have had macroeconomics will remember that phrase, right? That in macroeconomics, there's a long and variable lag. Discretion doesn't work. Therefore, we have to have binding rules rather than discretion over that time. Because if I engage in discretion, the activities that I think I need to do because I've recognized the problem, by the time they get implemented, that problem might not exist anymore. And then we end up by causing problems by the way we implemented this. Okay. Instead, he focuses on the incentive structure of the administrative apparatus. All right, so that's a good essay just to read. Lavoie, on the other hand, my dissertation advisor, Don Lavoie, he develops in this book, Rival and Central Planning, he stresses the idea of the market as this process of discovery, utilization, dissemination of knowledge. And so the rival is higgling among the entrepreneurs. Notice what that is. Again, it's that activity to the left of the equilibrium point, right? The activity in which we're constantly engaged in agitation and exchange. And that's what generates the economic knowledge that allows us to sort from the infinite variety of technologically feasible projects, those that are economically viable. And this has to be discovered. It has to be discovered anew each day. And as Hayek puts it, either by the manager or by some alternative entrepreneur who enters into the market when this manager doesn't recognize what needs to be discovered. Okay, so, all right, this debate, to sum it up very quickly, got diverged into statics because it got diverged into neoclassical welfare economics rather than the activities that generate those welfare conclusions. We ended up by thinking only in terms of those optimality conditions. So there's a counter-revolution. Those counter-revolution, as I mentioned, comes in the form of Buchanan in Public Choice, Alchin in Property Rights, Coase in Law and Economics, Kerzner and others on entrepreneurship and the theory of the market process. Let me just use two quick examples to highlight to you. I've already mentioned Alchin and the rediscovery of private property rights. Again, the oldest argument in intellectual history. Why would economists need to learn in the 1950s that property rights mattered? We already know by reading Aristotle that property rights matter. Well, it's because we put blinders on in this debate. And so Alchin had to make us remember that property rights matter. Okay? Let me give you another example. The oldest and most accepted satire in all of intellectual history of economics is Bastiat's. It's not a right-left thing. Everyone understood it. All right, Bastiat's petition by the candlestick makers to the government for protection for unfair competition from the sun. All right, everyone used that example. It was hilarious, right? Bastiat was a genius of economic journalism and communication, and he summed up the special pleading by businesses and exposes them in this story of the candlestick makers petitioning the government because the sun is unfair competition. Stop the sun from shining, and then my candlesticks will do much better, right? Okay. We all knew that. Why did Gordon Tullock have to come up with the concept of rent seeking again? We all understood that. Adam Smith remembers a criticism of mercantilism, the sophistry of the businessmen. All right. It's because we purged economics of institutions and all this activity. And so we had to recreate it in the modern era. We had to recapture that low-hanging fruit about the idea that economic processes take place within an institutional background. That institutional background is defined by the political environment, the legal environment, the social environment. And then why is it that we had to understand about entrepreneurship? That is the trading of arbitrage activity, but also innovation. One of my favorite books that I read during the pandemic was Matt Ridley's book, How Innovation Works. If you haven't read it, please get it. But he has a great passage in there. He says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. Child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. How relevant is that to the post-1991 era in India yourself, right? Okay. So summing up of what we've learned, I'm going to just leave this for you because this will take me too long to go through and I'll waste more time. And I want to get to my point about contemporary relevance. So these are all just the things I've said so far, and you've heard me say them, and now you have them on a slide. All right, so does this theoretical debate have applied public policy relevance in the 20th century? So these are my books that I've written. If any of you are interested in any of this, take this slide, send me an email. I'll send you a PDF of these books. I'm not looking to sell them. I'll just send them to you for free. So this is the Soviet context. So I think this debate matters very, very, very relevant, obviously, to East and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union and the whole of the 20th century and into now the 21st century. But how about elsewhere? Well, how about to India, right? And as I mentioned, Nehruvian Fabian socialism mixed with Soviet-style central planning. You have the 5-year plans, you have your industrial policy, you have the licensing, and then you have the post-1991 reforms. Liberalization to reduce the government control over the economy, including the abolition of many of the licensing requirements, reduction in red tape, privatization of public sector enterprises, globalization, the opening up of the economy through reductions in tariffs, relaxations of import and export controls, allowing foreign direct investment, liberalization of exchange rates, all of that, okay, right? So one of the things originally, like back in the pre-1991 reforms, one of the things that development economics used to like to talk about was brain drain. And brain drain, especially from India. If I was, very talented software engineer, for example, in India, I would get out of India and I would go, to the West or somehow and be able to be my software engineer there. All right. And it's still the case that immigration is a major, driver of things. But at the same time, after 1991, people were able to develop those industries at home. Right. And talent pool was allocated that way. So it's not like just that the talent rich people that stay back in India going to become customs officers. Right. That used to be a big appointment. They are a customs officer. Why? Because you could get bribes. All right. And so that's one of the things that you would take these tests to be able to get, one of these nice positions. That was caused by the licensing and the controls. And then finally, the reforms that took place in the monetary fiscal system and financial sector, all post-1991. These are all related to the issues having to do with the difficulties of socialist economic planning. And that's been laid out by people from Shenoy back in the old days, right, to Bagwadi, right, as well as more like Western economists like P.T. Bauer and others like that. So the long history of this is important to look at. Sen, who's a genius, by the way, right? So Sen, none of these people are dumb. They're geniuses, which make their argument all that much stronger. But Sen, for example, is not somebody who fully gets this point about the economic calculation problem precisely because he's a social welfare economist. What I mean by that is not that he cares about the poor. That is true. That's why he studies famines and everything like that. But he is a social choice economist, which means that he believes that the fundamental problem in economic life is how do I have a social welfare function tangentially kiss on the outer frontier of the production possibility frontier, right? He's like Arrow in that sense. All right. And so what he's doing all the time is figuring out ways in which we can get that social welfare function, right? I'm going to maximize the social welfare function given the technological constraints of the time. And so that's his mental framework in which he sees the world. That's not like Hayek, who says there is no stable social welfare function because there is no society choosing, right? All there is individuals choosing, and all those individuals have different values and ends. And so we can't have an end-related system, right? Where you just have one end and then you do, right? What we have is a means-related interaction. So what we do is we interact with one another with all our different ends. We're living a pluralistic market society. That's why it's called the catalaxy. What we deal with is that we recognize stability of possession, transference only by consent, and the keeping of promises. So we are means related, not ends related. All right. Sen is an ends related thinker. That's one way to think about that. Genius, one of the smartest men to ever practice economics. But his framework, his eyeglasses, are of a social welfare function. And that means that he's going to be blind to certain issues. What about modern technology? So a lot of times people think calculation is computation. Oh, it's just too many equations. All right. Too many unknowns, too many equations. So, it's too difficult for us to do the calculation so quickly. And so now the modern computer has fixed this. Oscar Lange anticipated this. He says, let's put the simultaneous equations on an electronic computer and we'll obtain the solution in a second. Right? That's in 1967. Imagine the computing technology today rather than that. So was the calculation problem ever a computational complexity problem? Sometimes thinkers put it that way, right? When you read the earlier writers in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they put it that way because it was an easy way to summarize the point. All right. Too much information to process. Difficult in solving the production function of economic combinatorials. Right. Adaptation and speed of adjustment to changing consumer demands. Right. So all those things are actually true. Right. But they're not the central argument. So the central argument is not these. So in making an argument, sometimes people make what they call sort of focal arguments and global arguments, right? And so you have these, what is the global argument? What's these focal arguments? And what is the relationship between the two of those? So these are all rather, these focal arguments, but the global argument is this one about the fundamental nature of economic calculation and the necessity of the knowledge to be, in fact, generated from a process which, in the absence of, never gets generated. Therefore, that knowledge never gets developed, and therefore it can't go into the calculation. So this is the problem with this. But people think it's this computational issue. So Jack Ma, for example, argues that big data will make the market smarter, make it possible to plan and predict market forces so we can finally achieve a planned economy for the first time. All right. This book by Brett King and Richard Petty, where they define techno-socialism as a social outcome based on long-term sustainability, equality, and the advancement of humanity. Of course, it's a very good goal, right? We all like that. The means by which we'll achieve that are going to be the advanced computational power of artificial intelligence, which artificial intelligence, we are on the verge of perhaps solving the biggest mysteries of the universe. They will be able to allocate or automate society to provide untold abundance and prosperity. So back to economics. Remember, we're not against that end. Let's sign up for it. We all want to have Kurzweil's singularity moment. Boop, like this, and then the rest of us can sit on the beach and have a Mai Tai and say, nice life, or whatever, right? Because production will be taking place by all these robots or whatever. So back to the means end analysis. Are these means that are chosen going to obtain the ends that are sought? So this is what we have to ask. So again, Lavoie's point was, look, it's economic rivalry among competitors that the market generates knowledge that no rival on his own could possess in the absence of the rivalry. It just doesn't exist. The notes are never played, all right? And so it's never a computational complexity argument, but a contextual nature of knowledge argument. The market process is generative, not computational. It is commutative, not aggregative. So go back to my point about Sen. The reason why Arrow and Arovians believe that the social welfare economics undermines markets, as well as undermining democracy at times, right, is that, right, because the whole idea is that there's a paradox, right, Arrow's theorem, right, and but why does he think that applies to markets? Is because he thinks markets are aggregators of all the information. But markets are not aggregators, they're communicators. There's no way to aggregate from each of our individual preferences into a coherent social preference. We each have different individual preferences. The question is, can we communicate those preferences to others so they can satisfy them? All right? Not, can we aggregate them up? Right? And so the knowledge is commutative, not aggregative. It's tacit and tied to time and place, not explicit and universal. And so this means that it's a human process, human system. And so that means that we have to understand the difference between mind and machine. And it goes back to then a classic debate. So I just stumbled upon this debate very recently, which is a debate between Michael Polanyi and Alan Turing on mind and machine. And I recommend it to everyone. You can look it up and read about it. They were both at the University of Manchester after World War II. They had, migrated and landed their positions. Turing, as you know, famous for the Turing test, trying to show that the machine could mimic the sort of that of a man, right? That imitation game is derived from a game that was done earlier, in which you tried to determine whether or not a third party could determine whether or not a anonymous poster, like writer of a letter or something like that, was a male or a female, right? So you would have A and B behind a wall, A behind a wall and C on the other side of the wall, and C had to determine whether or not it was, when A wrote, whether or not A was a male or a female based on the coding of the way they wrote. Okay, so they would write out a sentence and, pass. And so you would say, oh, that's a woman who wrote that. Or no, that's a man who wrote that. It's the way, and whether or not a man could imitate a woman or a woman could imitate a man, right? Kind of idea. That's how that imitation game got started. And then what they did was they switched it over to machines. Can we, in fact, do this with machines? So what Polanyi, Herbert Dreyfus, a computer scientist, philosopher, John Searle, the philosopher, what they argued was that what computers can and can't do. They argued what computers can't do is mimic human intelligence, because human intelligence is embedded in meaning structures and in language. It's not just in the syntactic clarity of the language. It's in the semantics of the language. This is what's at stake right now in the discussion of large language models, right? And what's going on. So one of the ways to think about this is in a version of what's called social epistemology, and whether or not we're dealing with kind versus wicked learning environments. So a kind learning environment, by the way, could be intensely computationally difficult, okay? So a kind learning environment is one in which the parameters are fixed. So the game of chess is a kind learning environment. There's only so many spaces on the board. There's strict rules which govern how each of the pieces can move, and they can't violate those, right? So they have no free will. those pieces on the chessboard have no free will to go wherever the hell they want. They can only go as they're pre-designed. Now there's an amazing array of combinations of moves, right? And so chess masters, understand all of these various combinations. Excuse me, a computer can churn through them in a second. But that's different than the way in which, say, what you would call football or what we would call soccer player must adjust to various spins of the balls as they hit and go in ways that they might not have ever encountered before because of the way they bounced off of people and things like that. They have to adapt and adjust on the fly. In a game like soccer, right, what happens is the parameters are relatively free. The actors can move in directions, innovate in ways that they previously haven't done before. They can, they don't necessarily have to go this way. In fact, they can go that way to do something different and new and novel. So novelty, all of that stuff is involved. So this difference between fixed parameters and free parameters, and then ask yourself, what is an economic system like? Is it more like a game of chess, or is it more like a game of open-endedness in which the rules are not fixed, in which we have to, in fact, now, don't get me wrong, AI can be an extremely, immensely useful tool. I used it for this talk. You think that I know anything about, and I don't know that much, but you think I know anything, even just slightly a little bit, about the deep understanding of Indian economy? Right? But I go into ChatGPT and get a little tutorial talking back and forth with ChatGPT about India for a second, and I can pretend that I might actually know something about India for a nanosecond until you ask me difficult questions. And then I'll be like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Right? But it's a very useful tool, but it's not a substitute for deep understanding and deep learning. Markets require the entrepreneurs to be deep students of the market in which they're entering. It's reason why you have entrepreneurs see the world differently than others, right? So I'm sure that all of you know this, but in the United States, if you are the subgroup that has done the best in income class is Indian immigrants, all right? And Indian immigrants are these entrepreneurs. They come in and they see the world differently than what the current people do because a fish doesn't recognize the water that they swim in. So they treat it as a fixed parameter. But the individual that comes in that's not part of that set of fixed parameters, that set of tacit rigidness, they see the world differently. They can come up with novelty, creativity, right? Innovation, all the things that drive. Tremendous patterns. One of the reasons why I am an open borders person for economic growth and development reasons, besides the moral reasons behind it. Okay, so does this mean that we must accept the world as is? I'm going to end here. Jesus, I left hardly any time. Anyway, this is the book that you were referring to, Anshu. This is the most recent book, which is a collection of my essays. Living Economics is also a collection of essays, but it's more my technical papers in economics. Again, if anyone's interested in any of these things, I'll send them to you. I have them all on PDF. I don't, it doesn't bother me to give them away. So, I think we can still repair a broken world. That phrase, a broken world, is an old Hebrew idea that you can repair a broken world. And I think the way that we as economists can address this issue is that first, we have to teach economics the right way. Economics is a tool for the curious and the compassionate. It's a tool for the curious. It's not just a technical science that, we put our white coats on and we walk away. It is a tool for the curious that want to understand the world. And it's a tool for the compassionate to have effective compassion rather than willy-nilly compassion. We have to reaffirm Adam Smith's liberal plan for liberty, equality, and justice. And we have to recognize that in redoing that, we are taking Hayek's ideas in the restatement of the liberal principles of political economy and justice, but applying them for the world that we live in today. And that's the challenge to your generation, is to do that. You must make the project exciting for the best and the brightest among you about how to explore the nature of a free society and recognize that our alternative is not to find freedom in government plans and activities, but instead in the individuals and the communities in which they live in. And so that's, I think, the enduring lesson that we learned from this century-long debate. Okay, I will stop sharing and I can try to address some questions. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Professor, for your very extensive talk. I'm sure all of us here loved it. So, moving on, we just wanted to ask you very quickly how much time probably you can have to address some of the questions. Given that it's
I have a hard deadline at around 9:45 or so, or 10. Yeah.
okay. Sure. In which case, I think Pushkar had one question, and then we can directly proceed on to having questions from the audience. So, Pushkar,
Right. Thank you, Professor Boettke, for such an extensive presentation. There's one thing that struck to me, uh, the normative component of how, which was the second point that you had alluded to, the ideological and methodological divide, and this reminded me of Professor McCloskey's work, where she talks about how the rise of the modern economy and the modern world and income coincided with a distinct culture and disposition towards economic activity as well. Now, those of us in the global south, such as in India, often find that this broader culture towards economics, towards the economy, and towards growth is absent, wherein people get together in the market setting in order to work in enhancing productivity and as per market incentives. So, how far do you think the role of culture is important, drawing on Professor McCloskey's work, when it comes to, let's say, countries like India, wherein a part of the reason why people suspected capitalism and market activity because people didn't feel that we were ready for it. So, how would you respond to, how do you take such arguments?
Hold on a second. I'm just giving myself a note. So post-communism taught us a lot. Originally, we thought that we were just going to need to get prices right because these economies were characterized by shortage economies. All right. So they had queuing lines, all this stuff like that. That's in the informal sector. So when we think about, we see shortage economies, what do? Right? Price must be set below the market clearing level. So we just need to get the prices set right. Right. And so the original debates, this is in essence, in many ways, what the Washington Consensus was about, was let's get the prices right. Okay. As we started to experience efforts to try to get the prices right, we realized you cannot get the prices right unless you get the institutions right. So this is why privatization and various different things, but not only that, but also legal reforms, change in your regular, make sure you have an independent central bank, all these kind of things, independent central bank that follows strict monetary rules. That gives us, a better hope for sound money than, a politically charged, central bank and blah, 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 and all that. Well, then once we realize, okay, so, why is it that some countries can get the institutions and other countries can't? Well, then we're like, oh, culture matters. All right. And so you have to get the culture in a certain way to align. Now, here's the issue with that. So I gladly accept your observation about the relationship between what I'm arguing, what McCloskey's arguing. Yes, there's very, very strong parallels and agreements in that with what she develops in that story. Because it's about giving dignity and respect to ordinary people. And that's, in her story, what the catalyst of growth is not necessarily the exception of property rights, but it's the general change in the way we talk about one another, such that we give dignity and respect to individuals for them to give it a go, as she puts it, for them to be able to have opportunity, what she calls is equality of permission, right? Everyone has the same, permission to go out and give it a try. Okay. Now, I think where McCloskey goes wrong is that there's an interaction effect between the institutions and those cultural attitudes. And so, and there's shifts in the margin. So there's not like just a diff and diff, right? Where what I do is I have an event, the Magna Carta, boom. And then after that, I see this. It's that the Magna Carta makes adjacent possible additional steps in the accumulation of liberties until we get liberty. So liberty is made up of a slow, hard-earned battle of different liberties over time. And that is the slow evolution of both social and cultural attitudes, as well as institutional instantiations of those attitudes. Okay, that happens. But we have to have those ideas. Now, here's the real problem, is that the concept of freedom and liberty is in every language. All right, this is, so some of you, I know that you're some students of Liberty, you'll know about Liberty Fund. If you look at Liberty Fund, they use the ancient Samaritan, logo for liberty is their idea. And if you go to Wabash College, where Pierre Goodridge, the founder of Liberty Fund, went to school, he has a Goodridge library, and on the wall is etched in all of the world's languages, the term liberty is etched in stone. So liberty is everywhere. There's no culture that doesn't have a concept of liberty, but liberty is understood culturally specific, right? If that makes any sense. And so when we're talking about developing a culture of liberty, we can't just, give someone Adam Smith and say, here, read Adam Smith. What we have to do is we have to actually find indigenous sources for those cultural ideas, because those are embedded in our language and meaning structures that make us a nation, make us a people. And that's what we have to tap into. But they have to be ones in the end where they have the functional significance, not necessarily the form, but the functional significance of property, contract, and consent. All right. Now, they might not look the same as they do in the United Kingdom or in the United States, but you have to have that institutional instantiation of property, contract, and consent in order to give dignity and respect to ordinary individuals that allow. And so one way to think about this in a big way is that what liberalism promises is that ordinary individuals can do extraordinary things if only given the freedom to pursue them. Whereas the alternative is only extraordinary people can do extraordinary things if only we give them the power to do things. Okay? So it's really about freedom versus power. And can we tap into our local cultural context to encourage the culture of freedom as opposed to the culture of power? Yeah.
Professor, for that answer. So we already have our audience who are putting their questions in the chat box. I'll take up Surya's question. He asks that, is the AGR argument oblivious to the role of state intervention and industrial policies in the development of today's well-off countries? How far have countries like the United States and Britain achieved their economic growth through extractive variables like protectionism and state-led planning?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an empirical question. The second part of your question. So Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, they're the Nobel laureates from 2024. If you read the book, The Narrow Corridor, that's just Acemoglu and Robinson. Or Why Nations Fail, that's Acemoglu and Robinson. The AJR refers to an earlier one, which is on colonial origins. And the intuition in the colonial origins paper is pretty straightforward. It's that if I, as a colonial power, move to a country that its environment is habitable for me, I'm going to want to bring my institutions to that country. If it's inhabitable for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract as much out of that and move on. It's what Mansur Olson referred to as stationary bandit versus a roving bandit. And so that's why they use settler mortality as their instrument, right? So if I go to a place and settler mortality is low, meaning that if I go to a place, I'm not going to die from disease and things like that very quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be a stationary bandit, and I will have institutions that maximize growth. But if I go to a place and the mortality rate is high, meaning that I'm going to die quick or whatever, what I want to do is I want to extract as much out as possible and then get the hell out of there. and that means I'll be a roving bandit. Okay. So there's a link between all these different thinkers and this kind of idea. That intuition is actually not that bizarre to think about. It's actually, okay, that makes intuitive sense. It's, okay, I get it. But what includes inclusive institutions and extractive institutions? We know more what it means to be an extractive institution in a weird way than we know what it means to be an inclusive institution. Because what we really know about inclusive institutions that maximize growth is that what we have to do is we have to take a revenue maximizing Leviathan. And because of the rules of the game, they maximize their revenue by maximizing wealth. So by growing Q rather than increasing T, right? So T being the tax rate, Q being the pie, right? So you want to grow the Q. So what all is entailed in all of that? And that's going to be the big question that we have to answer for development economics. So now, is it the case that countries like the United States and Great Britain were made better off by extractive institutions? Now, first thing I should say, go back to my slide, take the world as is. The world as is one in which the state has always had a thumb in the economic process. The question empirically is whether or not that thumb weighed a lot or a little, but not that it never was a thumb, right, on the system. All right. So it is definitely the case that the US government has engaged in protectionism, that the UK government engaged in colonialism and all of these other things like that. Question is whether or not, and slavery, for example, in the United States and the United Kingdom. The question is whether or not those are, when we do our best estimates, what is the estimate of them in the contribution to the growth? So if I want to compare entrepreneurial innovation to, extractive military extraction of resources, which one has the greater component to economic growth when we do it? We want to decompose that and look at that. And I would argue on the side that what we have seen is that the extractive institutions of the West are not the reason why the West grew rich. The reason why the West grew rich was the expansion of markets and the refinements in the division of labor. Okay, so it's a virtuous cycle. Expand the market, refine division of labor. Expand the market, refine division of labor. We get more and more complicated exchanges, more remote exchanges, more higher yields. And so that's done not by extractive, but by instead embracing of markets. But it is an ongoing debate in economics. My favorite old book on this is a book by Nathan Rosenberg called How the West Grew Rich. Which it does is it lays out all the contending alternative hypotheses, slavery, blah, 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 all those things like colonialism. And then it counters them with the evidence that we have. Now, that book was written a long time ago. More recently, there's a book by my colleague, Mark Koyama and Jared Rubin. It's called How the World Grew Rich. And it explains in more general terms, but it does still deal with the different competing hypotheses, knock some down, embrace others. So again, goes back to your point, Pushkar, that you brought up about McCloskey. That is McCloskey's whole project. You cannot explain the second volume of the trilogy is why modern economics can explain economic growth, right? And it's all about the idea that these contending hypotheses, right, that are put forward either by neoclassical economists or by critics of neoclassical economics can explain the amazing economic growth that's been experienced, right? So like when you think about, McCloskey, right, you think about world history and it goes like this, whoop, right? And it's this whoop that we have to explain. And that can't be explained by these alternative explanations. If those alternative explanations were true, what we would see is this, like it would be a scalar, right? That's how the growth would take place. It'd be scalar, not this non-scalar like whoop, all right? And it's that extraordinary aspect of it that we as economists are drawn to wanting to understand. Sorry for so long-winded again, but yeah. I'll try to be shorter. Do you want me to just read the next question?
Yeah, sure. It's perfectly fine. You can take as long as you want to, Professor. So Shubhangi has asked a question. She has written that in transitioning economies such as post Soviet states, decentralization of economic planning was often touted as the remedy for inefficiency. Yet many regions experienced chaotic privatizations, wealth concentration, and public disenchantment. And she's also drawn a comparison in the Indian experience, and she's written that similarly, India's 1991 economic liberalization offered an interesting parallel. Prior to 1991, India's economy was characterized by rent seeking, protectionism, and so forth. But even after liberalization took place, there's still been a challenge in the persistence of cronyism and concentrated benefits for a select few post reforms. And she has asked that since you have studied the Soviet system so well as an expert on the matter, what do you see as the critical factors that differentiate successful transitions to market economies from those that falter or regress? So essentially, what are some of the factors that look at successful transitions from those economies that were sort of inflicted with Soviet era socialism? I think one case that comes to our mind is Georgia, for instance, having a successful.
Yes, Georgia is a great case, and the Rose Revolution, is a great case. I in those books that I listed of mine, I have one on Estonia, and Estonia is a great example as well of successful transition. But again, Estonia is a small country. Okay, so there's a huge difference between talking about reform in Estonia and talking about reform in India, which are just talking about like scalability issues, which are huge. And let alone in some of these other, like the post-Soviet context, Russia or whatever. Yes, cronyism has been an omnipresent problem in the liberal project. It has undermined liberalism. Think about Argentina and Menem. So this is before the current Argentinian practice. But if you go back to the 1990s, they had what they called a liberalization project, and the political leadership simply lined their own pockets. As the economy did adjust and have some good recovery, the political leadership lined its own pockets with its friends and whatnot. And so it undermined, and that became the source of the criticism of what they call neoliberalism, right? It's like, oh, look, the neoliberalism is just, same as the old, like liberalism or whatever. And so I think we have to really be very critical of the involvement of the state in these economic activities, because once we have sort of this rising amount of cronyism and involvement in the state, think about the United States, for example. Let's just use this. 30 years ago, Microsoft had no presence in Washington, D.C. Today, it has one of the largest budgets for expenditures for lobbying activity in Washington, D.C. All right. So, yes, Microsoft's a great company, blah, 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 but they also have become a crony capitalist company. All right. Same thing with Apple, same thing with Facebook, right? Zuckerberg, is being, having to testify. And they're going to have like a committee that's set up to regulate, platforms. And he says, I will gladly volunteer to be on that committee. Right? Of course you would, because that's what's called regulatory capture. Right? And economists have studied this. So what we need to do is we actually have to really examine that, and study closely. We probably cannot study globally that question, but have to actually look at small micro stories. So, for example, the development of Uber. All right. So the development of Uber against the licensing of the taxi cabs. All right. And how is it that Uber was able to erode the market share of the taxi cab medallions? For years in the United States, in the major cities, to drive a taxi was licensed, regulated, and limited. So you had a very high price to get into that industry. Same thing in the UK with the black cabs. Okay, how did Uber and Lyft and these alternative ride-sharing things come in and penetrate that market? What can we learn from that for transitions in general? In a more radical sense, might be what cryptocurrencies are thinking about doing in terms of breaking up the government monopoly over the supply of money, right? You might end up by seeing how it is that the cryptocurrencies come in. On the other hand, cryptocurrencies may in fact be prone to the very cronyism that we're talking about. In the United States right now, there's people that want the government to be now involved in cryptocurrencies. Why? Because they want to actually protect rather than have them faced against competition, right? So we always have to sort out between what we call protecting from competition and protecting competition. And it's a constant issue and pressure by businessmen to protect themselves from the rigors of competition. And so we need to constrain the government such that it can't, do that. And so that's a tough issue. It's one that we all deal with. And, the question in the first one is that it goes back to the question about culture, because you have to have a culture which doesn't look to the government for those special favors. At the same time, you need to have a government that's unwilling when people look to the special favors to grant them. And that requires rules so institutional problems demand institutional fixes. We need to use our creativity to think about ways to tie effectively the ruler's hands. In my book, Why Perestroika Failed, I give a list of some of those ideas. In the Poland example, we talk about the Balcerowicz reforms. Right? In the Estonia case, we talk about Mart Laar and the reforms that were followed there in Estonia. But again, each of these solutions are very context dependent, and they require us to study them. Yeah. Let me say one other thing about this, which is fascinating from a human point of view. Many years ago, I went to a talk by Albert Hirschman, the great social scientist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And the title of his talk was Industrialization, East, West, North, and South. All right. And what he pointed out was he used literature, memoirs, and like plays and things like that to see how the people, the intellectuals, responded to transition periods. Okay. And in every one of them, they had massive discontent. Every one, massive discontent. And so the question is that is when you had like a bad start state and you had a good end state, but yet you had massive discontent. So what's going on here in some kind of things? There's like a presentism bias. And so if you look at like the 19th century in England and you compare now I'm not saying, by the way, that in 1848 life was all hunky-dory and wonderful. It wasn't. It's horrible, okay, compared to today. But compared to 1750, it was like unbelievable, right? So if you go back to the 18th century, when parents would have children, they would name each of their kid the same name. Anshu, 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 Anshu for 10, because only 1 out of 10 would live to adulthood. And so they want to have that family name sort of stay in practice. We see a tremendous decline in infant mortality over the century into the late 19th century, right? It's an amazing improvement. But what happened as that amazing improvement? People moved to cities. What happened when they moved to cities? Right now they're on top of each other. So they used to be out on the farm, right? Now they're out in the countryside. So what is the worst thing that could happen out in the countryside? Bad weather, famine, you don't make it through the winter. What's the worst thing that can happen when you're in the city, right? Macro volatility, because the factory goes out of work. Now all of a sudden you have idleness, unemployment. You had idleness and unemployment out on the farm, but you didn't call it unemployment. You just called it starving. Now you're in the city and you're on top of each other. Plus you have disease because you're in close proximity with one another. You have all these other things. So we constantly are having to, as we have progress, also address what progress comes, with it and the tensions that are involved in it. And so this is one of the really fascinating things. And going back to the question again, how is it that we talk about others? Do we talk about others as the source of our problems, or we talk about others as the opportunity for us for mutual gain from trade? And so do we think in terms of positive sum interactions or negative sum interactions? And this is a key mental mindset and there's a new paper out by Nathan Nunn, the economist Nathan Nunn, on this. Do people think in zero sum or do they think in positive sum terms? To go back to your cultural point.
Thank you, Professor, for that answer. I think we can have the final question of the session because you would also have to leave at 10. In which case, I think we're going to ask one question which we had from our organizer side, which is talking about Austrian economics. By the way, for those of you who may not be acquainted, Austrian economics, it's a branch of economics, I'd say, that has evolved significantly from the foundations by Menger, Mises, and Hayek. And it has influenced debates on market processes, for instance, the socialist calculation debate that we just talked about. On this instance, we just wanted to ask if, for instance, Karen Ivon, in a book on Austrian economics and political economy, mentions that even though Austrians have spent a lot of time in theoretical refutation of central planning, they haven't done much actually to advance a corresponding theory of welfare. So you see, there's too much of a focus on negative heuristic and not exactly on what is to be done or positive heuristic. So methodologically, we just wanted to ask, looking at the future of this branch of economics, Austrian economics, how does this position itself against the more mainstream economic methodologies today? For instance, the use of econometrics versus, say, something like praxeology, for that matter.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. Chris Coyne and I have a survey of modern Austrian economics in one of the top mainstream journals. We were invited by Philip Agion and Tim Besley to write that piece. It's called New Thinking in Austrian Economics. It's a survey from 2000 to 2020. If anyone wants it, I'll send it. I'll send it on to you as soon as we're done here this afternoon when I get back. But there's an ongoing dialogue among economists. The issue with econometrics, let me say that real quickly, is whether or not econometrics tests a theory or whether or not it is a useful tool in illustrating the power of a theory. Okay? So the way most people put it up in the positivist methodology is they think about econometrics as testing our theories. Okay? And that's the way they frame it. And so the criticism by Mises or Hayek against econometrics is in that context, or for that matter, Rothbard. It is in the context of people claiming they can test the theory by this econometric test. And they mean by that demand curve slope downward, that individuals are rational, any kind of thing like that, right? But on the other hand, if you think that economics is much more like the life sciences, like biology and things like that, rather than like physics, then you don't necessarily test the theory of evolution, right? That's not what you do in biology. That's not what biologists do. What they do is they illuminate and illustrate, right, this idea. So again, if we use Popper as an idea, we think about our economic theories as spotlights, not necessarily as buckets in which you throw data. We need to have a spotlight that shines. And when we shine on some things, we necessarily cloud out other things. And so that's the more we know we don't know. So that means we need to take our spotlight and move it to different areas. But what we're doing is illuminating a theory, right? And that's what praxeology helps us do. Illuminate, provide understanding, not necessarily prediction and control. And so that's the sort of bigger debate there. But a lot of people demand economists to give prediction and control. But if by the nature of our science, we're like life sciences, more like evolution, rather than like physics, right, which is different, then we're not going to be able to do the prediction and control. And so this is the point of Hayek's Nobel lecture, right, which is that what happens is we're applying scientism, that is a wrong view of science, to a discipline that can't behave that way. And by doing that, we cheapen the science. Now, that's a bigger, broader issue. You also asked a sort of more specific issue, which is about welfare economics. And let me just say the following thing on that, is that this is one of the reasons why I think in my postgraduate career, the work of Jim Buchanan has probably had the largest delta in appreciation, meaning that I was a student of Buchanan's and I always thought the world of him. But I think more of the world of him today than I did even when I was a student of his, 40 years ago. So the reason is because he offers a way for us to think about welfare economics. It's a wonderful essay of his called Positive Economics, Welfare Economics, and Political Economy. And the basic idea is, how is it that we think about these system effects when we don't have an Archimedean point to stand outside the system and judge it from above? But instead, we have to study the system from bubbling up from the bottom, right? From coming up from the bottom. And so that means that we have to focus on exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And so that is our welfare economics, is focusing on whether or not we can generate the kind of mutually beneficial exchanges. So the question we have to ask is, and this is a good way to end actually on this topic, which is, how do alternative institutional arrangements impact the ability of individuals to pursue productive specialization, right? And realize peaceful social cooperation through exchange? Institutions change in that. To put it in a very broad brush segment, we have as human beings two natural propensities. One, a Smithian one, which is to truck, barter, and exchange. The other is a Hobbesian one, which is to pillage and plunder. All right? If our institutions reward pillaging and plundering more than truck, barter, and exchange, we will engage in basically extractive institutions. We will, in fact, engage in raiding rather than trading. But if our institutions are such that we value truck, barter, and exchanging more than we value pillage and plunder, then we're going to have inclusive institutions, right? And we're going to engage in trading rather than raiding. And the wealth of nations and the wealth and poverty of nations determined on that very basic thing. Do we rely on trading or do we rely on raiding? If we rely on raiding one another, we are going to end up by having a war of all against all. If we engage in trading with one another, we end up by generating expansion of the wealth of nations. And so it's really in that key to that prosperity that we have to find our hope. And so our greatest answer to all of our social ills is economic growth. The more we grow, the more we have generalized prosperity, the more we're able to address all of the social ills that confront us. We have better technology available to us, better means of addressing these issues, and that's what we really have to embrace. So yeah.
Professor Boettke, for that. I think to formally conclude, a small vote of thanks. Firstly, of course, Professor Boettke, thank you for joining in here and taking this session. I think it's quite early morning for you there at home, and it's evening for us. And technology, it's wonderful.
Yeah, right. It is.
And also thank you to my society members for joining in here this evening. Thank you to SFL people and my colleagues and friends from the Center for Civil Society as well. And we'll also keep doing more sessions ahead. And thank you, Professor, for your time.